Just a couple of additional words to introduce myself a little bit. As Cola's already mentioned, I'm one of the tutors at Queen's in Birmingham, and some familiar faces from folk who have passed through Queen's over the time I've been there, and it's lovely to see you all today. You may be thinking, I kind of recognise that name, Rachel Starr, and it may be because you did the Worship Leaders and Local Preachers course recently, and the book that I wrote with David Holgate is used in that course, so on biblical hermeneutics. Or it may be that you've recently read the God in Love Unite Us report, and you'll have come across one of my other books in that report, which is about marriage in context of domestic violence, which is the work that I did for my PhD doctoral studies in Argentina. So hopefully you're not already bored of me, I think is what I'm saying, and it's lovely to be with you this morning and the rest of the day too, and I hope we'll have a really good day together. So let's just see, where do we begin? Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was that we're going to have Sue and Steve are going to be reading out the whole of the text of Ruth for us this morning, so we're going to hear it all out loud, but you will also have a copy of the text. I think that's in a little white leaflet with an orange bit on the front, and you'll also have a handout with some different coloured pictures on it. So those are the kind of things that you need in front of you for this morning. The handout on the one side, the first side is Peace and Justice Shall Kiss on the Road with Ruth. So we've already begun this work really, but I wanted us to start off the day by thinking about some of the expectations and experiences of the book of Ruth that we bring to this day, because we rarely come to a biblical text without bringing something with us, our own life experience, our own understanding of the text, previous readings of it. So it's always good to kind of name those things at the beginning and to think about what we're expecting from this text that we're going to explore further today. So a question for you to consider at the beginning, which is on your handout, is this one. What kind of story is this? Have a little think and perhaps put down a couple of words on your handout if you can, and then we'll hear a couple of people's reflections. So what kind of story is this book of Ruth? What kind of story would you describe it as? Has everyone got something down, a word, a phrase? Let's hear a couple of those. So who's got a word that they want to share? And I think we've got a mic going round.
Reconciliation.
A story of reconciliation. Okay, thank you. Lovely. Okay, a few more.
A story of inclusion of others in God's chosen people.
Okay, a story of inclusion and chosenness as well within that. Thank you.
An ancestor story.
An ancestor story, okay, yeah. Something about those who have walked before us on the way.
A story of redemption.
A story of redemption.
A story of perseverance.
Perseverance, okay, thank you. And one more, I think somebody here had their hand up. Yeah, lovely.
Background of the history of King David.
The background of the history of King David, okay, oh great. So some great themes and a variety of different ways in which you've chosen to interpret that question. Well, maybe we'll start with things that this story perhaps is or is not. So I would say this is not a simple story. It's multi-layered, and scholars have recognised that increasingly over time. For a long time it was seen as a very simple, nice kind of pastoral story, a story about life in the countryside in uncomplicated times. Scholars now think, no, there's much more to it than that in many different ways. Even the grammar and the syntax are complicated, which we don't necessarily pick up unless we're familiar with the Hebrew, but there's many different layers, fractures and tensions within the text. This is not a serious story. It's a comedy, it's comic. It's maybe even described as carnivalesque. There's something of the wild, free abandon about it, as we'll come back to. This is a more difficult one. This is not a safe story. It's a story which includes many acts of violence, spoken or unspoken, challenged or passed unchallenged. And that's something that we might pay particular attention to in our own reading of it, as well as in how we respond to that when it touches on points of violence in our own lives. And the final one that may be a disappointment to some of you, this is not a love story. Well, okay, perhaps it is. Perhaps it's about love in different ways, but it's certainly not a story about happily ever afters. It's not a story about marriage. It's a story about survival. So let's move on then to think about some of the context of this book. And the first context I want us to think about is the context of the historical context, so to speak. Where does Ruth take place? I've got my slides the wrong way around, I think, my appearances. So Ruth takes place in the gap between, in the days when the judges ruled and the reign of King David. That's the space in which Ruth takes place. That's its narrative setting. It's a transitional book between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. And for that reason, some interpreters think it's a book that's written to justify the rule of the kings. Those of you who've read the book of Samuel recently or can remember when you read it will know that there are two very different traditions about the kings in Samuel. There's one that's very positive and there's one that is very critical. And Ruth would seem to fall on the more positive end. So suggesting that things had gone horribly wrong under the judges, and the book of Ruth introduces a shift towards a time of stability under the kings. That's certainly its narrative setting. But in terms of its actual setting, when it was written, most scholars think it was written later on in what we sometimes refer to as the Persian period, or the period after the exile in Babylon, when what was at the height of the discussion for the community of Judah wasn't about kingship, because the kings had finished, the time of the kings had come to an end. It was about identity and about ethnic identity. This was a community that was very small and under threat in the vastness of the Persian Empire, feeling like it was going to lose itself in the sea of the Persian Empire. And so it asked questions about, what do we do when we're feeling under threat? What do we do when we're not sure about who we are? Let's draw our boundaries tighter. Let's exclude people. Let's push people away. Might sound familiar to some of us. Ruth and perhaps Jonah are conversation partners in that discussion, and very strongly Ruth seems to be critiquing the idea that we get in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, that the ethnic boundaries should be drawn very tightly, and particularly Ezra and Nehemiah are concerned about foreign wives and the idea that they should be sent away, whereas Ruth presents a story in which a foreign woman brings blessing into the community of Israel. So that's probably more likely the theological and political context of this text, a text which is about discussions around identity. Okay, so far so good? Yep, all right then. So what about the social context? Well, clearly Ruth is a book that is concerned with the law, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. I think when Christians hear the word law, we often set it against things like spirit or grace. But what we need to remember is, for the Jewish community then and now, the law is a gift from God. It's something that brings us closer to God. It's a joy and a delight, and it's something to be treasured. Ruth is often read around the time, the festival of Shavuot, which is a celebration of the giving of the law as well as the harvest. So this means that Ruth is intricately linked into the celebration of the law. And that's no surprise when we come to look at the content of Ruth, because there's lots of different themes there that pick up about debates within the law, themes within the law. So we have, for example, the rulings around gleaning, which we'll come back to. But who can tell us a little bit about what is gleaning? Somebody give us a quick definition of that. Leftovers, yeah. So picking up leftovers, yeah. So it's something about the abundance, not wasting that, making sure all are included, particularly those who are poor or the stranger as well have a particular right to glean in the fields. So in part, Ruth is a story about how if we share out our resources, there's enough for everybody. It also involves something which is probably very unfamiliar to many of us, this idea of the lever or the levirate marriage system, which, again, some of you, let's have someone have a go at what we think that's about. Somebody want to tell us what the lever or the levirate marriage is?
Marrying your brother's widow.
Yes, okay, so it's the idea that if a man dies before he has a child, then his brother has the responsibility to have a child with his widow in order for the name of the man to continue. Now, for a long time, Ruth was thought to be primarily focused on this, obviously quite complicated, tricky law. But again, scholars these days think it doesn't really quite fit. It's there, it's part of the story, but it's not wholly what it's about. Neither does it particularly fit around the teaching to do with the kin and redeemer. So the kin redeemer, who is a person that we'll come back to, but basically is again a responsibility of someone close in the family has a responsibility to redeem a person within that family who has fallen into debt or who faces the possibility of having to sell their land because of debt. And the redeemer kind of restores what is due to that family, keeps things together. So, question marks about whether those two are actually as central to Ruth as we might think, but they're certainly present. Final word on that list, boundaries. As we've already mentioned, Ruth seems to be very much about boundaries and about who is outside and inside, who brings righteousness, who is seen as welcome within the community. And particularly, Ruth talks a lot about the community of Moab. Now, what do we know about Moab? Well, there's a lot of negative feeling towards Moab in the Bible from the Israelite community. So although Moab is a close neighbour of Judah and shares lots of similarities in culture and other things, there's also a history of kind of grievances, a feeling that people didn't look after, that the Moabites didn't look after the Israelites when they were in the wilderness, and also this kind of stain on the Moabites community, with the implication that they are the result of an incestuous relationship when Lot has sex with his daughters. And that's where Moab is supposed to come from, according to the biblical tradition. The Moabites, I'm sure, would have told it differently. Okay, so we've thought a little bit about the historic and the social context for Ruth. What about the canonical context? Where do we find Ruth in the Bible? Or perhaps a more interesting question would be, which texts of the Bible might we read Ruth alongside? When we're reading Ruth, where do we jump to? The Bible is designed as a conversation, as texts kind of in dialogue, alluding to each other, back and forth. So have a think and maybe note down on your handout, which are some of the texts that you are linked to from your reading of Ruth? Where does Ruth take you? Have maybe a little chat with your neighbour too. All right, so again, to interrupt, what are some of the texts that we might associate with Ruth? Let's just have people shout out and we'll hear some. Joseph. Okay. All right. So the kind of tradition around Joseph within Genesis. Lovely. Okay. Great. Others?
Boaz and the line of going through to Jesus, the genealogy.
Yeah, in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew. Yeah. Lovely. Okay. Any more?
Why does it link with Joseph? Sorry.
Well, we'll come back to that in a minute, but that's a good question. Let's hear a few more kind of names of the biblical texts, and then we'll come back and see where we've gone with them.
Esther.
Esther, okay, great.
Jonah.
Okay, Jonah, all right. A few more.
The women at the resurrection.
The women at the resurrection, okay, that's an interesting one. All right, okay, we might come back to that one. All right, the 23rd Psalm, okay, I like that one too. That's again an interesting one we'll explore further. All right, let's see what I had down on my list. All right, so a few that you've picked up and a few more. So let's just work through those and then see what else we gained from your insights as well. Leviticus and Deuteronomy, obviously because of the references to legal codes there. So, and again, this is it's something we need to be attentive to, as if we identify as Christians and we're reading this text as Christians, we sometimes miss some of those connections that are very central within a Jewish reading of the text that we need to hold on to. Judges and Samuel, because of the position where the text is within the Christian tradition. Esther, someone mentioned Esther. So what was the connection with Esther?
One of the main ones is it's another female named book.
Yeah.
But also where a woman seems to be a critical sort of tipping point in something.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's particularly one part which is very close to Esther that we'll come to. But yeah, I think just the fact that this text is named for a woman plays a central role. And it's a similar short novella, that's what we would call, which is why it's also linked to Jonah, both in terms of the length and the style, but also the discussion around ethnicity. And that brings us to Joseph, perhaps. Who said Joseph? Okay, so one of the links to Joseph would be, again, that Joseph is seen as a novella, a short story that's placed at the end of the book of Genesis, but has kind of common themes and explorations around identity and relationships and power. Anything else you wanted to say on the link to Joseph?
Well, there's a link in terms of the famine.
Yes, yeah, that's a good link. Yeah, great. Yeah, so the kind of movement because of famine. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, good. Just carry on in the middle. Proverbs. In some traditions, Ruth is placed after Proverbs because Proverbs ends with the poem about the strong woman, sometimes called the good wife, but let me tell you that she's not the good wife, she's the strong woman, so let's call her that. And there's two other women in Proverbs that Ruth also echoes, the woman who is seen as strange and the woman who is seen as wise. So there's themes of all those running through. Song of Songs, because of those themes about intimacy, about desire. There's lots of desire in Ruth, some of it directed in problematic ways, but certainly there's desire there. Job, why would I put down Job as a connecting point? Who's most like Job in the book of Ruth? Naomi, yeah, because of loss and because of beginning with a loss and then somehow at the end, that perhaps being suggested by the text that loss has been overcome, although I think many of us would want to challenge that and say, loss is not so easy to overcome. Matthew, somebody mentioned Matthew, we find Ruth appearing at the beginning of Matthew in the genealogy, and we'll come back to that. James I had down as well as a text also about faithful living, about living well in community. And then we had, what haven't I mentioned? There was a Psalms, wasn't there? And so Psalm 23, who wanted to say something about that? Who was it who said something?
It was just that we're starting from, we're on a proverbial journey, and you're going through really hard times, really down to your very bottom proper shoeless and coatless and everything. And yet there is this table to prepare, and there are enemies all around, we refer to them, and so there is hope and there is redemption.
Okay, good, thank you. So something there about how Ruth echoes some of the central themes to the Psalms, which are about refuge and provision. Wonderful. And then at the back we had that comment about Ruth being connected to the women who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. Say a little bit more about that if you can.
Simply that through a woman comes good news or redemption, and without the women at the resurrection we wouldn't know anything about it.
Yeah, okay, so this is a text which enables us to see more clearly some of the roles that women have taken within the stories of faith. Okay, wonderful. Did we cover everything? Yes. We've thought about how Ruth fits into her context in a variety of different ways. The final slide on context is about the interpretive context. And I've put up there just a few of the scholars who have been particularly influential in my work on Ruth. What do you notice about them? I mean, they're all women, that's one thing to notice. There are men who write on Ruth, and there are plenty of really good, important and valuable texts written by men on Ruth, but it just happens that I've selected particularly women who are writing from a feminist perspective. Anything that you notice about these women? Okay. Yeah, so people talked about names and about a breadth of ethnicity, a breadth of ethnic identity, a breadth of context. So we've got a number of Jewish scholars there, a number of scholars who are writing from womanist perspectives, that's African American women's perspectives, women who are writing from post-colonial perspectives, so Gail Yee and Musa Dube. Musa Dube is from Botswana and Gail Yee identifies as Asian American. Lots of different, and Kwok Lan as well, who's a Chinese American scholar. Many different voices writing on Ruth from contexts and experiences that may be quite different to ours. All of them will be different in some way to ours, and that's the wonder of biblical studies. You get to see how someone else is reading the text, and you're not just falling back on your own resources. So if you're not familiar with some of those scholars, have a little browse around and read a little bit of the work they do. All right, we're going to move on and get to the text of Ruth at last. So you'll see from the Bible Notes magazine that I've structured the Bible notes around the 4 chapters, and each chapter I've given the name of one of the characters within Ruth. Orpah, Boaz, Ruth or Naomi. And in a way, the book of Ruth could have been named any of those characters. So one thing would be to think, how would we read this text differently if it was called the book of Boaz, for example, or the book of Naomi, or the book of Orpah? Whose story is this? That will be a question that we're going to come to. So we'll begin with chapter 1, and then we'll do chapter 2, we'll have a break then and come back to chapters 3 and 4. The book of Orpah, chapter 1. The book of Orpah, chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, begins with questions about bread. It's primarily focused on whether there is bread to eat or not. So we begin in the house of bread, Bethlehem, which has no bread. So immediately you see the irony there. And we end back in the house of bread, Bethlehem, which is at a time of harvest, i.e. we have reached a time of bread. And in the middle, there's quite a focus on companions, those on the road. Companion, the word echoing again, those who we share bread with, compan, with bread, those who we share bread with. So that's the kind of basic movement of chapter 1, from a place of no bread through a time of sharing bread to a place of bread. And that sets us up for some of the key themes that we'll explore within this chapter. So I'm going to ask, I think Steve is going to be reading chapter 1 for us. So first of all, we're going to hear the first 5 verses of chapter 1.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. He and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. When they'd lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons or her husband.
So the opening verses of this book are really doing a big kind of danger, alert, panic. That's what's happening with the first bit of the book. There's lots of keywords that we shouldn't miss that suggest that things are going terribly wrong and things do not look good for the people involved in this story. There is mention of the time of Judges where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, a bad time. There is mention of famine, which is seen in lots of different ways, but tends to be connected in some way with something that has gone wrong, something that is broken in society. And there is several mentions of Moab that we've already talked about, is the kind of place where the people from Judah shouldn't go, should stay away from. So if we miss that kind of alert, we're not picking up what the writers of the story want us to pick up. This is a story that is going to go very wrong very quickly. And yes, it does. Very quickly, we get rid of a lot of the key characters who are introduced, don't we? In a way, their names suggest their fate before it's even kind of announced within the text. So Elimelech, which means my God is king. Now that sounds very positive, but we already know that Elimelech has abandoned the community that is facing famine, fled to Moab, and is living in a time of judges where there is the rule of the judges rather than kings. So we're kind of feeling that things aren't going to go very well from him, and they don't. We have Naomi, that perhaps it is a name that means pleasant, but it's quite ambiguous. We'll come back to that. And then we have the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, which basically means a little illness, a little destruction. So it's no surprise that they also end up very quickly dead and gone. Now, in the rabbinical tradition, there's lots of discussion about why they die. What did they do wrong? And for some scholars, what they do wrong is marry Moabite wives, and that's what causes their death. But for some feminist scholars and womanist scholars, and particularly I'm thinking about the work of Will Gaffney here, there's a focus on how Mahlon and Chilion take their wives, and the feeling that the text suggests that Orpah and Ruth are taken violently, are raped and then married. And perhaps that is what is being condemned with the text and the death of the sons. So perhaps the sons are being judged by their violence rather than their marrying outside the community. All right, well, let's carry on with the story and see what other things... Oh, just before we go, we'll talk about Orpah and Ruth, shall we? So we have their names and not much more about them at this stage. Both, interestingly, could be linked to water in some way. So Ruth perhaps means satisfied or saturated. There's a sense of generosity in her name. And Orpah sometimes is associated with cloud and the idea of water also falling from her. So there's a possibility of both names being associated with water. And I wanted to flag that up because often what happens is Orpah and Ruth are set against each other, rather than being seen somehow in community. So we'll see what happens to them. So Steve, can we have verses 6 to 14, please?
Then she started to return with her daughter-in-law from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered for his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law. and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." And then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there were hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." And then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her.
Thank you. So what do we notice about this image of called Ruth and Naomi, but you'll see that Orpah is in there too? What do we notice? Somebody want to comment on the image by the Chinese artist He Qi?
It's kind of sad, isn't it? The Orpah figure.
Yes.
Tends to feel like a sad
Yeah.
expression.
Yeah, there's a sadness, there's a sorrow, there's a grief there, isn't there, between all three women in some ways. Yeah. Anything else? One other comment? Yeah, at the back.
They're all intertwined.
They're all intertwined, yeah. Their kind of identity and their well-being is connected in. And on the floor, there's the basket with 3 grains, isn't there? Kind of perhaps representing the 3 women. So
there's a sense of you've kind of got where the heads are, but then you've got circles that could almost look like a baby caught up in there, or there could be a bowl in there which is about provision.
yeah, so there's something. I mean, that there could be their breasts. There could be, yes, kind of looking forward to the birth of Obed at the end of the story. Certainly, yeah. Okay. So I think what I want to say about this section of the text is that it's a story about sorrow and grief and loss. These are 3 women who love and care and support for each other. And there's a lot of what Naomi does is try to kind of figure out how these 2 younger women are going to survive. She starts off with a blessing to say, "Oh, I hope that God blesses you and gives you everything that you need." And gives you, what you need to survive. And then actually in the Hebrew, so I'm told, that kind of is interrupted. And she talks very directly to the women and says, "Look, find husbands, get married, because that's what they're going to need to survive." So on the one hand, she's saying, "I hope God blesses you and supports you." And then suddenly she's like, "Who am I kidding? You need to go and find husbands." Okay, so there's a kind of break, a rupture there. And she pushes the women to think about how they're going to survive and makes it clear that they cannot survive easily with her. There's lots of different reasons, partly because of her age, but also because they are unsuitable women in the community to which she will return. They will be Moabite women there, and they will not be welcomed within the community, certainly not as potential wives. So that's part of what's going on there. So we have Orpah leaving the story at this point. She's still there until verses 14, which I think until I did the study of the Bible, I'd kind of forgotten how long she's in the story. She's in for quite a long time. And we don't hear anything further about her, do we, after that point? As I've already alluded to, she's often very heavily criticised and suggested that she turns her back on the true faith, whether that's Judaism or Christianity, that she goes back to pagan ways, and that she deserts Naomi in her time of need. However, some of the post-colonial feminist scholars have reread Orpah in a much more positive way. So I wanted to introduce the work of Musa Dube, pictured there, who's a Botswanan biblical scholar. She wrote this kind of lovely piece of imaginary letters that Orpah is sending to Ruth over the years. I don't know if anyone can see that enough to read it out for us, or shall I read it? I'd probably better be reading it with the mic. So this is just an extract from the final letter that Orpah writes to her sister Ruth. I often wonder what became of you and Naomi in Bethlehem. Sometimes I wish I could see you. My daughter was named Ruth after you, for in this land you shall never be forgotten. When you have borne children, you should tell them stories of the Moabites, their origins, kindness, hospitality, and struggle to survive. These are the true words of Orpah, your eldest Moabite sister, the one who returned to her mother's house and to her gods. So we might think about how Orpah's story continues beyond the pages of this text, and how we might listen for clues to where it might lead. Okay, so the next section, please, if we can have 15 to 18.
So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her.
So you may have noticed on the screen, instead of the Lord, I've put the 4 letters of the divine name, which is often unspoken, but we might say Yahweh. And that's a reminder of the fact that the Lord in capital letters always stands for this divine name, which does not mean Lord. It means the one who is, the one who is becoming, the one who calls into being, the Almighty, the source of all life. That's what the word means. What is this promise that Ruth makes to Naomi? We have a variety of different options before us. On the one hand, we might think about it as a vow of loyalty, and we have very similar phrasing between men who are committing to serve each other. So, for example, one of the community, the Friends of David, makes a similar vow to serve with him in battle, I think. Secondly, we have the idea that this is a pledge of love. A love which is complex and ambiguous, and we're not quite sure what the relationship between Ruth and Naomi is, but there's certainly love there within it. And for this reason, this text is often used within marriage services, both between same-sex marriage services and opposite-sex marriage services. So there's a whole tradition of seeing this as a pledge of love, which other couples who are in love can emulate. And this has become a really important text for the LGBTQI+, or the queer community, who are reading this text and looking for signs of faithfulness between people of the same sex identity or gender identity. And I really like that reading. I like that reading. However, there's another reading which is less happy, less cheerful. Perhaps what Ruth is doing is not saying, "I love you, Naomi, and I'm going to stick with you through thick and thin," But she's saying to Naomi, save me. I need you to save me. I am going to contract myself, enslave myself in some way to you, to work for you, so that you will get me into the place I need to be. So here there's almost an echo of someone who traffics people. Naomi is a human trafficker, perhaps, someone who is willing to take on the resources, the youth, the vigour, the sexual possibility of Ruth to exploit within the field and on the threshing floor in order that she, Naomi, the older woman, may survive. So that is a pretty tricky reading, isn't it? And we might want to consider that. But, you know, it's there as a possibility. They're all there as possibilities for us. Right, let's have the final part of chapter 1. So, verses 19 to 22.
So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitter with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me? And the Almighty has brought calamity upon me." So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
Thank you. As the story begins with multiple references to the fact that Elimelech and Naomi are heading to Moab, it ends with multiple references to their return, to Naomi's return to Bethlehem. Naomi denies a lot of things in this passage. She denies that she has a companion. She makes no mention of Ruth. She denies her own identity and name. She says, "I'm not pleasant anymore, I'm bitter." And she denies that God is a God of plenty. The name Almighty here perhaps suggests a God who is connected to fertility in some way in the Hebrew. So there's a lot of denial going on. And again, some will judge Naomi very harshly for this. Say, "Oh, she's a bitter old woman. Look, she hasn't even kind of looked after Ruth." On the other hand, we might think about the fact that Naomi has lost her husband and 2 sons and is in grief. And we may want to recognise the trauma she has been through when she's naming what she feels she cannot be anymore. All right then, we're moving on to chapter 2. Let's have our first passage from chapter 2. Thank you, Sue. Just before we get to that, just to mention that the middle 2 chapters of Ruth are kind of a pair. So the first and 4th chapter are a pair, and 2 and 3 are a pair. And the middle 2 chapters are more focused on perhaps the relationship between Ruth and Boaz. So there's a shift slightly. Although at the beginning and the end of the chapters, Ruth always seems to be with Naomi. She's with Naomi, she goes and spends time with Boaz, she comes back to Naomi and reports back. But that's the kind of shift that we've got in tone. So if we can hear Sue from chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, please.
Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favour." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting, even for a moment."
So here we have the introduction of the concept of gleaning and how that fits within the wider social context in which Ruth is set. We also have a lot of connections to things that we might recognise from our own communities today, about seasonal workers, about people coming in doing hard physical work out in the fields under any kind of circumstances of weather, often paid poorly, often very unstable communities where they live, and lack of contracts, etc. People who are vital to us being able to eat and survive, and yet are often overlooked. And again, this is something that feels very present for now when we think about those people who we have in the past invited to come and work in our fields, and they have come, and now we are facing a time where those questions are up for debate. When we hear how the man who is in charge of the field introduces Ruth, we see some of that lasting prejudice. She is the Moabite from Moab, is how he describes her. Basically, she's the foreigner, she's the foreign woman, and that's repeated again and again. Her foreignness is the thing that is most present for the man. So an image here, a photograph entitled Ruth and Naomi Gleaning, from an Israeli photographer and artist. Again, this perhaps reminds us about gleaning as an activity that is done even today. We may not call it that, but our waste, our leftover, our recycling is often what other people are forced to live off. And that might be a reminder to us about how we share the resources we have. I think, if possible, Sue, we might have the next part of the reading, so from verses 8 to 16, please.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favour in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favour in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At the mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley.
So we'll just pause there and then we'll finish off the rest of the chapter in a moment. So in this passage, Boaz, similar to Naomi, invokes the blessing of God. So expresses his faith in a God who brings about shelter and food, who brings about protection and provision. And particularly here, I'm drawn to the work of Elsa Tamez. I'm always drawn to the work of Elsa Tamez. She's one of my favourite theologians and biblical scholars. She's a Mexican feminist scholar. She writes a beautiful piece about the idea of God as bread love. She says we should have a new name for God, which is bread love, or amor pan in Spanish. Because she says that is what God desires for us and God seeks for us, bread and love. Bread lovingly given, bread lovingly shared, the love that enables us to exist even in the lack of bread. And she says that when those things aren't present, that's a sign that things are wrong, that things are unjust, because God is a God who is hungry for justice, hungry for bread to share with us, hungry for love to share with us. What's interesting here is that Boaz is the one who begins to enact the blessings. So he says, may God, and then he himself starts to provide the grain, the shelter, the protection to Ruth, and through Ruth to Naomi also. So he is living out his faith in a very clear way. All right then, so our final part of Ruth chapter 2, if we can go to verse 23.
She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, otherwise you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Thank you. So just a couple of final points on this chapter before we have a well-earned break. We might note that Boaz and Naomi, the older characters within this story, are both keen to set boundaries for Ruth. And they encourage her to either stay with the young men or stay with the young women, to not go into unknown fields. And Boaz warns his workers not to bother. The actual word is don't assault this woman. But a question we might ask as preachers or just as decent human beings would be, why is it that Ruth has to change her behaviour? Why is it that the threat of violence, sexual or physical, isn't challenged directly against those who are committing it, and the kind of structures that enable young foreign women to be seen as legitimate targets for violence? So a question there might be, what does Ruth to teach us about seeking justice for ourselves and for others? How do we challenge the behaviour and the systems that enable some people to be seen as legitimate targets or victims? And a final word on Boaz as the redeemer in some way. We note that although God is the redeemer throughout the whole of the biblical story, to redeem is first and foremost a practical task. And so it's the redemption of what risks being lost, whether the relatives are falling into debt or slavery or family land is about to be sold. That is what, at the beginning of the tradition, is what is needed to be redeemed. People from enslavement or land from being sold. The word to redeem, the Redeemer, is used more intensively in Ruth than in any other biblical text. So it's clearly a key theme for this story. And it's interesting, though, that it's often the people who aren't required to redeem that end up doing the redemption. So Boaz isn't actually the one who's required to redeem the land, and yet it's him who does. And it's actually Obed who is described as redeeming Naomi from being forgotten, from her name being lost. So redemption comes from slightly unexpected places in the book of Ruth.